Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. This is the first session of a BMP Summit virtual format. This is the second year of BMP Summit virtual format, and we had a very good success last year. So this year we are following the same format. We have our today's first presenter, Chris Pettit, Director, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Office of Agriculture Water Policy. And Chris will get us some information on SB 712 and a record keeping requirement. We have two speakers from Office of Agriculture Water Policy, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. After Chris, we have another speaker, Yesenia, and she is an environmental manager. We will take all the questions at the end of this session. There will be a quick survey questionnaire that will take around 35 to 40 seconds to complete it. It will help us to improve our BMP Summit for next year. Please take your time to fill that survey. As I said, it's less than 1 minute, and we'll take all the questions after both presentations. And if you have any other question, please you can send that question in the chat. Thank you, Chris. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Lakesh. I think I'm unmuted. So having glanced at the attendee list, lots of folks have seen a lot of these slides before. I think, you know, my approach on this, I want to give some updates as to what's going on and where we're at in some of the processes that we kicked off when we came into the office, and then we're working through and implementing 712 and some things that we're seeing in the field. So you know, bear with me. A lot of these slides are going to be familiar. I do have with me Yesenia Escribano, who is one of my very, very talented, amazing policy staff. She's going to kind of take what we're doing nuts and bolts and take us into that interdepartmental type of a framework and scenario where how do we take what we see on the ground through our great field staff operations and maintenance type framework, as well as the data management and the land use mapping and whatnot, and how that translates to the way in which we integrate with our sister agencies in the cooperative framework. So you're going to get kind of a big picture policy and interactive look today. I'm going to go first, try and take a little bit of time, go ahead and take any questions. Yesenia then will do her PowerPoint, and we'll both take some questions at the end. So without further ado, if I can get my screen to move. There we go. Hold on, let me get back here. Starting slide, that's operator error, by the way. We talk about this a lot, but I feel like it's very, very important to reiterate this, to continue to talk about what the regulatory framework looks like. I mean, best management practices are, as we all understand, identified in statute, defined in statute, and they're management strategies that improve, you know, the efficiencies in nutrient management, irrigation management, and water resource management. And the idea is, you've heard me use the metaphor that bowl, and the bowl, you know, based on the fact that we've stuffed the third largest population into the 22nd largest state by geography. We continue to have an economic foundation predicated on 1,000 people a day, 120 million people coming to live. And, you know, an additional, you know, we're having to raise more in terms of agricultural production on less land over time. So we've got to look at how to be, you know, the most efficient in doing that. We have to balance production, which is a very individualistic decision based on, you know, are you a 10-acre, 40-acre, 60-acre parcel? Are you subsistence? Are you a rural homestead? Are you a hobby farm? Are you an 11,000 acre large scale, producer with a large scale commodity contract? Those are all individualistic market-based decisions, and they've got to be tied into water resource protection, which is a cumulative impacts analysis that not only involves all the producers in a given basin, but also involves all those other inputs, be it point and non-point, within a basin, which is why what Yesenia is going to talk about is so important. It's based on the best available science and technology. Thank you to our partners at the University of Florida and the great Michael Dukes and all the folks that we have the pleasure to partner with on research and all the great work that IFAS and other academic institutions do. And they have to be technically and economically feasible, which is something that occurs at the manual level. I mean, we go through great interaction with our partners at DEP to make sure that the BMPs are initially verified as effective. And then we look at what is applicable on the landscape and what has to be properly implemented, not what folks want to do, not what folks have been doing over time, but what are the applicable BMPs that have to be implemented in order to give you that presumption of compliance with state water quality standards. We talked through our role, of course, is to go ahead and go through very intense review of the manuals and the BMPs. We use extensive academic literature. We develop the BMPs, we put them in manuals, we adopt them by rule. They are regulatory. We assist the producers in proper implementation. We continue to fund research, and as we are aware, there's part of 712 that's going to facilitate even better coordination with research that includes us, it includes DEP, it includes those academic institutions with agricultural programs. We then get out, and 712 requires it every 2 years, do implementation verification visits. We audit records. We go ahead and work with producers to get things done. As we are implementing 712, we are learning a lot of really good lessons that are building on past experience in the field, also building on what we're seeing in terms of the new record keeping requirements coming out of 712. These are the manuals. We continue to interact and be very much ready to go on the next iteration of the cattle manual. We're waiting for the go ahead to publish that and get out in front of that. sod is also in the same spot. Hemp, we're continuing to do, I see Zach on the line, we're doing some great research to do a standalone hemp manual. You see diversified operation, I'm going to talk about that in a later slide. Citrus is currently in the process. We've got a really good meeting set up in later this week, in fact, to talk through some comments that we've gotten on that manual and how we update that manual. We've got a meeting set on specialty fruit and nuts and we are rapidly looking at how we're going to update our regulatory plan and what our next kind of bite for the next fiscal year is going to look like, and continuing to update these manuals. I will also, just in terms of emerging issues, call attention to the bottom right of this slide. Imperiled species, based on some rulemaking that Fish and Wildlife is doing. There are updated, shall we say, points of interest, and that is a manual that probably could stand to be updated based on some species that have dropped off, some species that have been added. It is something that is going to be of interest and continues to be of interest, both for us and folks that are involved in silviculture in the near future. Senate Bill 712, I just wanted to reiterate where we were. Statutory language, every 2 years, we've got to do an IV visit. This builds off the 2016 legislation that mandated IV visits to confirm implementation. We are now moving from implementation to this lovely new phrase, properly implemented. So, what does it mean to properly implement a BMP? What does it mean in a nutrient management sense? We are continuing to evolve as we look at the implementation of current BMP manuals, and we keep this in mind as we update the BMP manuals. We have to collect and review anywhere that there's a pencil mark in the manual. So all those records that were previously required. We're continuing to have to collect and review for compliance with the BMPs to make sure that you are properly implementing those BMPs. We, including but not limited to, so there is a subset of those. Now, we've undertaken the rulemaking, the initial manuals, the documentation required, such as every nutrient application that takes place on the landscape. Those were developed for compliance purposes. So we took a look at what we needed to retain for the purposes of providing records to the Department of Environmental Protection that can be utilized within the BMAP assessment framework. The BMAP assessment is predicated on the issue of impairment within that total maximum daily load. So we're talking mostly nutrients in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're looking at nutrient application that is taking place on the landscape in the form of nitrogen and phosphorus and those nutrient sources. So given the myriad of different ways in which record keeping occurs on the production landscape, which is another great learning experience that we're seeing as we're going through these IV visits, we're finding we found the need to clarify how we are going to get information obtained pursuant to the IV visits so that we can be consistent and clear in the way in which we, as Yesenia is going to talk about, interact with our interagency partners within those BMAPs. And those BMAPs exist. They look at annual aggregate data within a basin or sub-basin. We need to be able to interact as we coordinate with DEP to be able to talk about what the aggregate nutrient application is within these basins and sub-basins. We had to make sure that we could be efficient and effective working with producers to get clear, records of, what is occurring in terms of nutrient application on the landscape. So to that end, we have, this is just a summary of what that says. Use this slide a lot just to give the basic overview. So existing requirements, this is what we're looking to build from to clarify in terms of the information that we're obtaining. You've got to quantify all nutrient sources. You've got to, give us the documentation that we need to verify compliance, be that with IFAS recommended rates, be that with other BMPs that play into that holistic analysis of what has to be properly implemented on the landscape in order to get the presumption of compliance. You've got to quantify those nutrient sources and quantify what's being applied. You've got to plan, the nutrient applications to match the plant requirements. Soil and tissue testing is absolutely vital. UF recommendations are the default. We're continuing to have very good conversations and actively partner with IFAS. They've got a budget issue in the legislature to get out ahead on some of these rate issues. We are actively working to develop research plans and projects that not only address that, but other emerging issues of interest to make sure that, as is required, we are continue to be able to enhance our existing programs and determine where new BMPs or takes on old BMPs that can be done a little bit differently are appropriate. This is the just a manual that we pulled. All nutrient applications containing NNP. So you read that. If you're putting something on the landscape that has nitrogen or phosphorus in it, we need documentation that is what we're looking for. We have had in the manuals for many years examples of record keeping forms. Now we recognize that different producers at different levels of sophistication using different record keeping methods may do things a little bit differently. So the manuals have offered these as a template. We have not gone to a mandatory standardized form. I know that that's been discussed previously over time. However, we recognize the different variances in the way in which producers through the state, through the different manuals, kind of undertake their record keeping. So we focus on the outcomes. We focus on the information that we need to verify compliance, and then we focus on now that aggregate clarifying record that can go across manuals to get us the information that we need to be able to put it in a form and interact with our interagency partners in DEP. So every 2 years, back to this requirement, just to continue to put it in front of everybody, back to 2 years, collection and review, which is the existing BMP manuals. How do we retain records of NNP application that reflects the information that we need to give to DEP as a result of a record that's being done through the IB process. This was again the template form. This was the example that folks could utilize, that also could be the template to provide the information that we're looking for in the rule. And we'll get there in a minute. We talk about substantially similar records, and we continue to operate on the landscape to define that stuff that we need to get out of everything that's being kept for compliance purposes to be able to be successful in fulfilling our obligation under Senate Bill 712. Just to continue to work through this rule continues to be, we went through a proposed rule. We have a notice of change ready to go. The latest update on the rule is we did get some comments from JAPSI that we are working with them to address. Because of that, we have told the time for for rule development and the issuance of the notice of change. The rule is still forthcoming, and we are awaiting a collaborative decision as to when to move forward with the notice of change, the issuance of the statement of estimated regulatory costs in response to a lower cost regulatory alternative that we got, and just kind of the changes that we've made within that rule. So we are kind of awaiting the green light to move that forward. We've talked about what's in it. We've had to adopt changes to some definitions to get some clarity in how the enrollment process and IB process takes place. We've done the incorporation of the new 712 requirements, and we've also looked at updating nomenclature and timeframes within the corrective and remedial action section of the rule. Emerging issues, and I'm almost done. As we're on site and as we're having these conversations and as we're interacting with our partners, these are the things that are kind of coming out. Clarity in existing record keeping. We've got a number of folks that are utilizing third-party software providers or using spreadsheets or doing things electronically. We are actively encouraging the continued culture shift, I suppose I'll put it, to that electronic framework. And my background on this, I went through it when the water utilities throughout the state and actually throughout the country, EPA went to what they called an EZDMR, which is electronic record keeping, that transition. So they weren't getting scans of PDFs and other things. And that has a market impact on folks based on their technical capabilities and ways of doing business. So we are wanting to continue to encourage folks, given that you've got the age of computers, the internet. I think Al Gore invented the internet, if I remember right. You've got folks that are moving towards that. Everybody's got a computer on their hip at this point in terms of their iPhones and their various pieces of technology. So we are actively looking at technical assistance in record keeping. We are providing electronic versions of the nutrient application record form. We're actively working with the third-party software providers to come up with new and creative ways to get the information that we need to make record keeping more efficient. Now, that being said, you're going to still have folks that are smaller and medium growers, are based on the type of operation, based on the diversity of the operation, are still doing things in ledgers in various forms, and we're wanting to work with those folks and make sure that we are effective. We're limiting the intrusion of the government in the form of our regulatory office in their business operations. We're wanting to be flexible. We're wanting to work on that culture shift over time, but we're wanting to recognize where folks have been meticulous and very successful in existing record keeping. So we continue to work through that, and we're seeing a lot across manuals and across commodities. What that has done is very much elevate the policy decision that we made as it relates to the nutrient application record form and the need to come up with kind of consistent clarity in the information that we're wanting to get out and retain as part of these nutrient application records through either our NARF form or through a substantially similar record. IV site visit efficiency. We continue to look at the ways that IVs have been done, to look at the number of hours that it's taking to do IVs currently, to look at proper implementation. Obviously, the site visit and the need to see, the entirety of the production on the property is something that you don't walk away from, because you need to see that visual input. How to most effectively get through records when you're dealing with myriads of individual applications or different ways in which nutrient application occurs or irrigation implementation occurs, and the way in which we look at water resources and how to get at the best, most efficient holistic package of BMPs and implementation on the landscape to properly balance production with those cumulative impacts of water resource protection. On the enrollment side, and Yesenia's going to get into this a little bit further, but I wanted to set the table. As we go through our enrollment and mail out efforts under the BMAPs, we're seeing issues that when this was originally established, when this was a voluntary program, when this was a program that we wanted to try and get the greatest acuity bang for the buck, and we focused on intensive, we focused on irrigated, we focused on 50 acres and up. There was in the program in 5M1, we talk about agriculture under the BMAP as anything agriculture under 570, which is an enormously broad definition. As we get more sophistication, as we get more maturity in the programs, we're finding the Caloosahatchee BMAP is a great example. The C43 reservoir is considered agriculture currently. You have fish and wildlife lands. We've got in the Lake O, we've got the Avon Park bombing range. We've got any number of different state and local government owned lands. We've got those lands that are default to state and local governments, but they have leases on them that we've got to approach. We have hobby farms, we have rural homesteads, we have divorcees in Pennsylvania that happen to get a piece of property in Florida that has nothing on it, that's fallow, but is considered agricultural. All of these things that have significant cumulative impacts are things that we are rapidly seeing on the landscape that are giving rise to policy discussions that are becoming more acute as our BMAPs and our implementation programs get more mature, that are policy conversations that are coming, because when you're dealing with a myriad of 5 or 10 acre parcels, it becomes a really interesting environment when you look at other, be it the 10.2 environmental resource permit framework, be it the 100,000 gallons and under consumptive use permitting framework. When you look around the state, we come up with macro level policy decisions to deal with a number of micro level impacts that on a cumulative level are a massive resource impact, but it's how you deal with those cumulative impacts. So that conversation moving forward, I scared a lot of people when I said this Association of Counties, but it's something that we continue to chew on. We're not, we're interacting. You're seeing things on urban agriculture in the in the agriculture, in the legislature this year. How do we deal with that in terms of a BMP type of a context? It's a very interesting and dynamic situation that we're involved in. In the same realm, diversified operations, those operations that we feel as though absolutely fit within our policy framework, but you've got folks that are doing some citrus and you're doing some cattle and you maybe have some row crops, but you're doing it on a a much smaller level, you're doing it on a 25-acre parcel or a 40-acre parcel. How do we deal with, instead of 5 different enrollments and 5 different manuals, how do we deal with it in a diversified context where what we really want to get after is the holistic nutrient, irrigation, and water resource management on a parcel, so that we recognize, again, the viability of production tied to the water resource protection that we need to be, undertaking on the back end. And then the other thing that continues to arise is what we're looking at in terms of intensity of operations. And it's a very interesting interplay between some local government land use decisions, 67 constitutionally elected property appraisers exercising their authority under Chapter 193 and greenbelt tax exemptions in unique and fascinating ways. The DEP permitting frameworks and our authority, and frankly, what programs and processes and projects and operations fit under our BMP manuals. So, when we look at 53 horses on 7 acres, when we look at 90 cattle on 5 acres, when we look at completely denuded property that has a land use classification, but happens to have a green belt, and you've got 100 head of sheep or hogs or something else on 2 acres, and there's no grass growing, and there's a discharge into a regional body. How are we dealing with that? What are the at what point is it a water resource issue that goes to a different agency? At what point is it ours? At what point does it exist under an integrated context that involves not only land use regulation, but also other pieces? And these are not, again, there's not necessarily hard policy prescriptions coming out, but as our program is, again, maturing, becoming more sophisticated, we're throwing resources at it, and we're active on the ground. These are the type of things that we're seeing as we try and be more efficient and effective in how we implement our programs and be successful in realizing what the legislature and frankly the constituents of the state, taxpayers of the state, expect of us in terms of not only maintaining the viability of agriculture on the landscape, but also making sure that we are protecting and conserving the water resources of the state within that interagency context. So with that, this is how you find me. The line's always open, and the email's always on. Happy to take some questions. I know that we've talked through a lot of these things previously. Happy to also transition into Yesenia's great presentation that hopefully is going to be some new information and put some things in context as well. So, Lakesh.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. One question is, can produce fertilize based on recommendation or other scientific recommendation for their specific commodity? Panelists also said, okay, yeah. So I believe some manuals specify that this is acceptable. So how would you answer that? So that basically,
the manual that is being referred to is vegetable and agronomic prep, and the vegetable, the way that we are approaching again, we look at this holistically. And it's in Chapter 373. State law continues to identify the University of Florida as the starting point, and we've treated it as a starting point for agronomic rate discussion. That being said, it's a starting point. So we then go back to manuals that are currently in law and currently in regulation. So those manuals provide the ability and flexibility for producers to justify their the rates and the way in which they are holistically undertaking nutrient management on their landscape. So if there is a situation in which somebody wants to state that, and I'm just going to take an example, whatever commodity the University of Georgia or Mississippi State or somebody has done a study, and they can demonstrate that the geology or the soil makeup or whatever else is consistent, and that, again, it's not just production, it's also water resources protection. So there's also that need to talk about, did that University of Georgia study take into consideration water resource impacts on the back end as they looked at the various rates that they allowed for application? So, it becomes a holistic analysis, and we encourage folks to look at, that nutrient management and look at okay, what am I applying? Am I utilizing precision agriculture? If I'm doing that, then that's a quote unquote mitigating BMP that's being implemented. Am I doing some sort of a water resource protection BMP? Am I, what is my location? I mean, it does become again, a holistic analysis that we do want to offer every opportunity for producers to be able to justify how, through their not only nutrient management, but through their other BMPs, how are they balancing production with water resource protection, on a given parcel, so that then it is reflected in that basin-wide type of analysis. And a lot goes into that. The need to do the additional rate studies go into that. The need to, kind of quantify what all this looks like. I will say the last thing that we want to get into is the producers and production is an individualistic choice based on markets. So the last thing we want to get into is, messing with a market-based decision that's being made on an individual level by a producer. However, that's the individualistic, the individual analysis part of it. There's then the cumulative analysis part of it, is how does that production practice play into the larger cumulative impacts within our interagency collaborative framework of water resources protection under a BMAP. And we've just got to be conscious of that as we look at what proper implementation of nutrient management measures looks like.
Thank you, Chris. The second question is, are all areas in the BMP listed in manuals with record keeping pencil indicator now being regulated? For example, the BMP and citrus manual to keep records of all irrigation maintenance.
Well, that is, I mean, the now being regulated, that now is an interesting word to me, because this is the law. This has been the law. And I've said this in a couple of different forums, and I guess there's been, over time, there's been interesting policy discussions, but the manuals have been very clear over time in that they've been adopted. They are in rule. They are in Florida Administrative Code. They are the laws of the state. Where you see a pencil mark in the manual, since the date that manual has been adopted, that record keeping has been required. I think the nuance has come out in terms of how the compliance frameworks within those manuals have been implemented, which is more of a policy discussion, because again, the flexibility that we find, becomes, what are we getting at? What is the intent? What is the outcome of, on the irrigation piece, what's the outcome? The outcome is how are we demonstrating that on irrigation management, we're reducing the drop of impact that's coming from that, that parcel. How are we minimizing that to the greatest extent possible? So we utilize, mobile irrigation labs and the free services that we provide, through those to producers through, the section of law. We utilize our ability to work with producers on, what irrigation they're using and whether there's cost share to, get to a more efficient irrigation framework, or there's ways to improve efficiency in existing frameworks. I mean, those intensive outcomes, that's where those records are supposed to be driving us, is that collaborative relationship between us as the Office of Ag Waters Policy and the producer, to be able to look at how do we continue to work together to realize improved efficiencies on a given production landscape.
Hey, Chris, we still have a few more minutes to answer two more questions. So I think the other question is, how does this affect the greenhouse industry? I think how does this means probably how this law affect the greenhouse industry?
Well, I mean, we've got a nursery manual. Again, you know, and we've done a lot of really collaborative and fantastic projects with a lot of the you know, a lot of the nurseries, a lot of the, you know, a lot of the greenhouse folks and variety of different productions in that area. Again, if something is considered agriculture under the terms of law as it exists currently, the expectation right now is that, you know, if you're in a BMAP, you're either enrolled or doing you know, water quality monitoring. It's something that, again, we continue to have discussions across commodities, across manuals, and across various production practices to talk about applicability, to talk about flexibility, and to talk about how to best, again, the outcome here is how do we demonstrate that practice, you know, is viable as production and is minimizing whatever, you know, maximizing efficiency, minimizing whatever impacts the production may have on the broader water resource landscape. So we're actively communicating not only with those folks, but anybody who wants to have a conversation as to how we can be more efficient and effective in our programs.
Thank you, Chris. The other question, we'll take more questions at the end, but the last question for your presentation, can extension agent find out who has gone through an IV in their county?
Let's see, who has gone through an IV in the county? What I would do is punt that in the most effective way to accomplish, you know, some of these outreach, education, coordination efforts. We are working very closely, and I know I tease him a bit, but Dr. Dukes is just an amazing, and then I know a number of you know this, but he's just an amazing, brilliant man. He's working very closely with Catherine Holland on our office, from my office, on that coordination, and we're really trying to centralize and be kind of consistent across the state in terms of messaging and education and delivery, and how we can integrate our programs more effectively. So in terms of that context, I think that type of a discussion as to how we work with extension to continue the effectiveness of the extension programs and how they integrate with our governance framework is probably best handled, and we can probably tee it up and be happy to have the discussion as part of our continued coordination efforts, if that works with you, Michael.
Thank you for those kind words, Chris.
I expect the check is in the mail. I mean, you send it regularly.
I'm writing it right now.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Lakesh?
Thank you, Chris. I just want to take one last question. This is an important question. I have received some similar questions on my visit to some of the meetings. So the last question I would take is, in relation to phosphorus fertilizer input, what is the criteria for verification implementation now that the IFS is to look at the Melick 3 soil test?
Well, the existing law, again, I'll go back to the existing law is the existing law. The existing manuals are the existing manuals. I mean, when you're implementing a regulatory program, again, we implement the law as, you know, as is written. You know, it's, if I were to do, I saw Irene on the phone, so I know I've got a lawyer watching me. If I was to do aspirational rulemaking, as we've seen from certain agencies over time, that tends to get you in trouble when you're straying outside. The gist of the question is an interesting one because you know, we do have these ongoing conversations, and it gets back to this question of flexibility and how are we interacting with folks on a production landscape to ensure that we're looking holistically, and that holistic look is not only the nutrient application, but soil health in terms of what are the practices that are resulting in possible binding occurring on the landscape. What are the naturally occurring factors? What are your residual legacy type of issues that are coming out regarding landscape or production management over time? What are these various things that we have to consider when working with the producers to get the best possible result to balance those factors on the production landscape. And it's one of those that we have preached as we've implemented the requirements of 712 and frankly enhanced the efforts that have been in the requirements, our efforts regarding the requirements that have been in place since 2016. I mean, the law, the legal changes in 2020 through 712 didn't change all that much. It changed the frequency of IV visits. It didn't change existing manual requirements. It changed the what we were retaining. It didn't change existing record keeping requirements. So we have as a result of 712 seen a need to enhance the way in which we implement programs that were previously law that possibly could have been looked at a little bit differently in a different time, place, or manner. However, we continue to come back to flexibility, respecting and having the humility to work with the producer and be collaborative in recognizing what's going on the landscape and knowing that they're the experts of their individual production. We do have to step back and we have to look at it cumulatively. We have to look at it in terms of water resource protection, but it starts with that collaborative relationship with the producer. So it's all about flexibility. It's all about looking at what the intent of the manuals were and are, what the intent of the law is, and recognizing that there are adjustments that need to be made in the research sphere, and figuring out how to be true and faithful to the existing law, while recognizing that there are ongoing conversations, which to me is the definition of effective governance if you're going to be a humble public servant and do that.
Thank you, Chris, for answering all the questions in detail. I really appreciate that.
I didn't know I was allowed to say no, Lakesh. I thought I had to do whatever you said.
Well, you did a great job.
All right. Well, Yesenia, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but this is somebody who is more brilliant, more talented than I. I mean, she's one of my staff that, again, just does a phenomenal job, keeps me honest, asks all the hard questions. Again, any errors that are made in my office come through me. Any successes we have are really attributed to the phenomenal staff, be it Yesenia and her partners in policy, or the amazing field staff. I know I've got a few on, or my research staff and Catherine and the great work that she does with Dr. Dukes. She's got just some wonderful data that gets more kind of in the weeds, more in depth, talks about what we're doing in partnership with our state agency partners. Hope this is instructive, and Yesenia will kind of let you go from there.
Thank you, Chris. Yesenia, the floor is yours. Yesenia is environmental manager with the Florida Department of Agriculture, Office of Agricultural Water Policy, and she's gonna get us in more detail about SB 712 and record keeping stuff. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lakesh, and thank you, Chris, for that great introduction. I agree, we wouldn't be able to do what we do without everyone in our program. So it's because of all their good work that we're able to get stuff done. I do want to get a shout out to a lot of familiar names I see on the chat and on the participants list. So thank you for attending. We hope that this presentation is informative and really just provides a better background on how we interface with DEP when it comes to TMDLs and BMAPs. And as Chris said, there's a lot of interesting policy discussions that have been taking place and are going to continue to happen as we refine how we look at agriculture within TMDLs and BMAPs. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, and to confirm, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yep, looks good.
Awesome, great. So my presentation is going to give a brief overview of TMDLs and BMAPs. We're going to go over the BMAP framework, and then the rest of the presentation is essentially going to focus on how we coordinate with DEP when it comes to identifying agricultural lands within the BMAPs, enrollment tracking and reporting, estimating reduction for credits within the BMAPs, the areas that remain to be enrolled, and I'm going to talk a bit about our FDACS legislative report. So just as a reminder, a TMDL is the maximum amount of a pollutant that can be introduced into a water body without causing exceedances of water quality standards. It's essentially the water quality restoration target. OAP tracks TMDLs developed by DEP, and for TMDLs that have large amounts of agricultural lands relative to the area of interest, we provide DEP TMDL staff with up-to-date agricultural land use information and maybe some other things that they may want to consider. And then once DEP decides to develop a BMAP, that is where the engagement with the local producers and the DEP BMAP staff really starts. So a BMAP is the framework to achieve the TMDL. Currently, there are 5 pending BMAPs and 31 adopted BMAPs. Some of these adopted BMAPs are in their 2nd and 3rd iteration, for example, Indian River Lagoon or Orange Creek and Upper Klawaha. The first BMAP to be adopted was the Upper Klawaha BMAP in 2007, and the latest BMAPs to be adopted were the 2nd iteration of the Indian River Lagoon BMAPs in 2021. So there are different types of BMAPs. There are 11 adopted springs BMAPs and 20 adopted surface water BMAPs. 5 of the pending BMAPs are springs BMAPs. 2 of these BMAPs are brand new, and 3 are updates to the existing BMAPs. And all of these BMAPs are based on different land uses, model assumptions, and only 9 of them have required reductions assigned to stakeholders. And this is important considering that we are an entity that is present in all of these BMAPs, so we have to sort of stay on top of these different nuances. When we're talking about loads, there's also differences between springs and surface water BMAPs. So loads for agricultural non-point sources in the springs BMAPs were based off of the nitrogen source inventory loading tools, or INSOLTs for short, developed by DEP. And we see a screenshot of the INSOLT framework here on the top right of the screen. The INSOLTs are ArcGIS and spreadsheet-based tools that provide spatial estimates of the relative contribution of nitrogen from various sources. And they took into consideration transport pathways and processes affecting the various forms of nitrogen. And during the INSOLT development, FDACS worked closely with DEP on some of the later INSOLTs to identify appropriate application rates for crop fertilizer load estimates and identify land use coverages to help identify ag lands. And springs BMAPs do not have required reductions for stakeholder, but they do identify the amount of load that must be reduced. Okay, and I did skip over surface water BMAPs. So surface water BMAPs, excluding the fecal BMAPs, also use different land use coverages, event mean concentrations, runoff coefficients, rainfall, and other parameters to generate models from which DEP often produces GIS outputs with loading information. And these outputs are used for allocations, estimating existing loads for each entity, and then determining the required reductions for our stakeholders. And on the bottom right of the screen, we see a list of some of the different models that have been used by the surface water BMAPs. And so we often work closely with DEP if we can during the model development phase to refine the agricultural lands and modeling assumptions like event mean concentrations for different land use types. Okay, so again, the BMAP is a framework to achieve the TMDL that contains the local and state commitments to reduce pollutants. And this is sort of a flow chart. So DEP determines the contributing sources, the BMAP areas, and the stakeholders, and we are a coordinating agency within the BMAP framework. DEP develops the BMAPs and assigns required reductions where appropriate. And then stakeholders identify and implement projects to help meet the TMDL. BMAPs identify that the proper implementation of FDACS agricultural BMPs as a management strategy to address agricultural non-point sources. And FDACS is expected to enroll 100% of all agricultural lands within a BMAP and verify the proper implementation of said BMPs. DEP does the monitoring of the impaired water bodies and determines if progress in the pollutant load reductions are being achieved as a result of the stakeholder efforts. And if water quality problems persist despite appropriate implementation of the stakeholder measures, then DEP institutes a reevaluation of the BMAP. And another gentle reminder, so per 403.067, producers within a BMAP have the option to either enroll and implement BMPs for a presumption of compliance with water quality standards, or they can work with DEP or a corresponding water management district to implement a water quality monitoring plan at their expense and demonstrate that they are not having an impact on water resources. And as Chris mentioned, FDACS develops BMPs in coordination with UF stakeholders and other entities. The BMPs are verified as effective by DEP, and then the BMPs are adopted by FDACS into rule. So now that we've gone over what is a TMDL, what is a BMAP, and the overall framework, the rest of the presentation is going to focus on this coordination. So during BMAP development and following adoption, there is a lot of coordination. We, Office of Ag Water Policy, provides DEP agricultural acreages and crop type information. So what and where is the ag? We provide enrolled agricultural acreages by commodity. This is the main metric reported in all BMAPs. We also estimate nutrient reductions from enrollment, cost share, and other projects. And as of 2019, we've done unenrolled agriculture characterization within the BMAP areas. And so again, the rest of the presentation is going to take an in-depth look at these items and the related policy discussions. Okay. So when you have the expectation to enroll 100% of the agricultural lands, the first thing you want to do is identify what and where are the ag lands. And so in order to do this, FDACS uses the Florida Statewide Agriculture Irrigation Demand Geodatabase to identify the ag lands within BMAPs. The FSID is our central data repository for agricultural water use projections, and it also contains parcel level polygons of statewide agricultural lands and irrigated lands. This database is put together using a variety of data sources, and it's updated on an annual basis through ongoing mapping and ground truthing efforts. And as part of the BMAP development, we refine these agricultural lands using FSID. So kind of here shown in the pictures, we focus on identifying areas that are no longer ag or identify areas that have had large changes in commodities. And having one statewide coverage of agricultural lands has sort of allowed us to be more consistent when it comes to reporting agricultural land use metrics across the different BMAPs. So refinement of what and where is the agriculture is critical for BMAPs that have allocations and required reductions. DEP estimates the allocations and required reductions needed to achieve the TMDL based on areas identified as agriculture in the land use data at the time of model development, which can often be several years old. The land use changes we identify and submit to DEP are used to refine our starting loads, allocations, and required reductions. And then as the BMAP gets updated every 5 years, these massive evaluations are executed. And to the left of the screen, we have a picture of the St. Lucie BMAP and how DEP sort of identified the different land uses. And you can see in yellow the areas that were attributed to agricultural lands. And this was based on the land use of the model at the time. The top table, we have what the required reductions by entity look like for the difference of watersheds. In the bottom table, table B13, we have an example of the number of acres that we often submit to DEP for either land use change credit or for, again, refinement of their models. And on the bottom right, we have a list of the BMAPs with allocations. And these BMAPs, again, land use is very, very important because land use is the basis of how all these numbers get figured out. So after evaluating what and where is the ag, we provide DEP metrics on enrollment. So the enrollment metrics are based on the areas identified as agriculture within an enrolled parcel. And this is important because the enrolled parcel is based on the property appraiser boundary, and that often may include areas that are not necessarily in production. And so we use the FSED to refine the agricultural spaces within the enrolled parcel. And in earlier BMAPs, the enrollment metric was based on the entire parcel, which often tended to overestimate the acres of agriculture within the basin. And so now, since 2016, we have standardized saying, okay, enrolled agricultural acres are based on the FSED lands within enrolled features, and we do this for all BMAPs. Okay, so in this slide, we have an example of how agricultural acres are reported for surface water BMAPs. So we provide the status of enrollment at the time of BMAP development and annually for the statewide annual report. We often report enrollment by commodity, as you can see in the top table, and then also by sub-watershed, as you can see in the bottom table. And on the right, we have just what the maps look like that we often generate using enrollment. But again, this enrollment coverage is based on the entire parcel boundary. The refinement of agricultural lands is not captured in this map, but so it would be smaller areas, more refined areas that follow land use features, not the parcel boundaries. Okay. So for springs, we also report agricultural metrics of enrollment metrics by commodity. But for the springs BMAPs, we do it a little different for tracking purposes and to follow the structure of the insult, which you see here in the pie chart. We report by load type, so farm fertilizer versus livestock waste. We essentially take the different commodities identified in our enrollment, and then we crosswalk that into either farm fertilizer or livestock waste. And in the future, eventually we're going to figure out how to improve this process once we identify the best land use to identify agricultural lands within the springs BMAPs. So based on enrollment, as Chris mentioned earlier, we do provide some nutrient reductions, and this is critical because this is essentially the reductions that are being achieved to help meet the TMDL. So we estimate reductions from agricultural non-point sources, and we provide this information to DEP so that we can demonstrate that agriculture is meeting the required reductions and that these reductions are incorporated into the overall evaluation of progress towards achieving the TMDL. And we essentially use the latest enrollment available, and we identify the agricultural lands enrolled based on the BMAP model, not FSED. And the reason we do that is because the BMAP model contains the loads. And so then once we have the areas of agriculture on the BMAP model, we overlay enrollment, we identify the loads within the enrolled areas, and then based on reduction efficiencies that we use and that we've agreed upon with DEP, we identify the amount that's being reduced. And we have lots of interactions with DEP regarding how to do the calculations of the areas that are enrolled and how to apply the reduction efficiencies. And I'm going to get into that on the next slide. Okay, so the reductions we use for most of our BMAPs are based on the work completed by the Soil and Water Engineering Technology Group of Del Butcher, UF, and other leading ag experts that had knowledge on BMP implementation practices within the Caloosahatchee and Lake O and St. Lucie watersheds. And this team, this study essentially created nutrient reduction spreadsheets, and they were based on literature, land use data, observed flow nutrient data, and information from the watershed modeling projects. And the primary sources of the Ag BMP information were research and extension reports completed by IFAS in association with other states and grower groups. And there is currently ongoing coordination between DEP and FDACS on the appropriate reduction efficiencies associated with the BMAP agricultural land uses and how to update this work, given that it was completed some time ago. And there continue to be ongoing changes in the landscape and advancements in BMPs. And so here on this slide, what we have is a very simple screenshot of land use codes that you often find in the models, the commodity that was assigned to that land use type. And then through columns D and J, you kind of have the efficiencies that have been identified within the different BMAPs. And so there are several categories which we're working through with DEP to identify, okay, well, what is the best efficiency, and is this efficiency reasonable? Okay. And so this is a table that essentially summarizes how we estimate reductions based on enrollment for the different BMAPs. As you can see, there are several BMAPs that use the Butcher method, but like in the case of Orange Creek and Upper Oklawaha, it's a different methodology to estimate reductions based on enrollment. We just take essentially the agricultural acres enrolled, you apply the percent of the ag acres enrolled to the overall load, and then from that load, you identify a 30% reduction. In the case of the lower St. John's main stem, reductions are based on enrollment using a spreadsheet tool that uses tri-county ag area row crop ag reductions based on data collected from the TCA farms and fields, and base loading rates for the other commodity crops based on values generated by the TCA watershed assessment model. And this spreadsheet model was developed by the St. John's River Water Management District and DEP. And so we work closely in coordination with DEP to refine and document all of these different methodologies and assumptions and ensure that our calculations are properly accounted for when evaluating progress towards the TMDL. So when it comes to estimating reductions on enrollment for Springs BMAPs, FDACS is currently in discussion with DEP on how to calculate these reductions. The acreages used by DEP to estimate agricultural lands were based on data used in the insults, and the numbers you see in the BMAP were assuming 100% enrollment. So as of today, the question remains, how do we estimate reductions when there isn't 100% enrollment, and how can we incorporate FSID into the calculation of estimating reductions? Okay, so we've talked about what is ag, where is ag, and the enrollment metrics that we provide and reductions based on enrollment. So another form of reductions that we coordinate on with DEP is reductions based on cost share. And so the nutrient reductions for the cost share technologies are based on the 2016 Soil and Water Engineering Technology Report by Del Butcher, and these were discussed with DEP. We developed a methodology to estimate nutrient reductions for NOIs that have received cost share funding using the NOI boundary, as the treatment area information for the cost share is available limited. For parcels with more than one cost share project, we identified the order of treatment to determine the reductions for multiple projects. And then we created workbooks that provide cost share agriculture technologies associated with each NOI and the formulas used to estimate the nutrient reductions. So here in the slide on the left, we have a screenshot of our cost share projects statewide. And the inset is just an example of a cost share point that falls within an enrolled area. On the top right, we have the reductions that were assumed for the different cost share project types. And on the bottom is just a screenshot of the workbook that we created to assist with the calculation of the treatment train efficiencies when there was more than one project on an enrolled parcel. So beyond estimating nutrient reductions for enrollment and cost share, we also provide DEP reductions for other project types, specifically our hybrid wetland treatment trains and our managed aquatic vegetation plant systems. The hybrid wetland treatment technology is a combination of wetland and chemical treatment technologies designed to mainly remove phosphorus at the subbasin and parcel scales. We have 7 projects in the Lake Okeechobee BMAP, 1 in the Lower St. John's main stem BMAP, and another in the Upper Klawaha. And our consultants estimate the reductions based on the measured data collected at these sites. And we provide this information to DEP for inclusion in their overall estimations of achieving the TMDL. So after identifying what and where the ag lands within BMAPs and estimating reductions, the task that remains is to look at the lands identified as agriculture within the BMAP models and FSID that are not enrolled. And when we talk about what remains to be enrolled, the following topics often come up: inactive operations, urban agriculture, rural homesteads, fallow grazing lands. And the question is, how do we best define and quantify these types of land so that it can be properly evaluated within the BMAP framework and by others who are involved in the BMAP? So we recognize that there are land uses within the BMAP that were initially identified as agriculture, but upon closer look at the data, there's ambiguity as to whether there is agricultural activity or if a parcel is enrollable within the purview of OAP. And FDACS has characterized the unenrolled areas identified as ag within BMAP since 2019, starting with the South Florida BMAP updates. This analysis is accomplished by overlaying property appraiser parcel data with the areas identified as ag within the BMAPs. And we look at the property appraiser land use codes, the descriptions, the ag tax exemptions, the owner information, how many parcels are associated with an owner name, the parcel size, and other planning boundaries such as zoning and future land use or urban service areas to determine if a parcel is likely or unlikely used for agriculture. And lands that may be classified as agriculture but are unlikely to have enrollable agricultural activity include parcels that are used as utilities, communications, schools, mines, military lands, churches, rights of ways, or other similar land uses. Parcels that do not have an ag tax classification and the property land use indicates urban or commercial uses or abandoned or single family residential or are located within residential subdivisions. And so all of this information is being used as the basis for ongoing policy discussions between FDACS and DEP. Specifically, are these lands part of a state or water management district restoration or water storage project? What is the workload associated with enrolling the thousands of smaller parcels? The estimation of allocations and required reductions for agriculture. In other words, where do these lands fit in the ledger that was assigned to agriculture? These lands do impact us achieving 100% of the expectation of enrolling 100% of the lands. And how do we use this information to refine future BMAP land use models? So here we have an example of the characterization that we do, and the Upper Klawaha BMAP meeting is soon, so I chose to discuss this BMAP. So what you see is that we have the BMAP area, and the FSED ag lands comprise about 18% of the overall BMAP area. 22,000 acres are enrolled, and 78,000 acres remain to be enrolled. And we evaluated that remaining acreage, and after applying all the different data sets that I just mentioned, we determined that there is approximately 36,000 acres of unlikely enrollable areas and 43,000 of likely enrollable areas. but having the pie chart kind of gives you a really good perspective of what those numbers mean. So let's take a closer look at some of the unlikely enrollable categories that we identified. So timber, these are acreages that were identified using the property appraiser land use classification and are enrollable under FDACS's Forest Service silviculture BMPs. Unenrolled ag within state lands, there's approximately 5,000 acres. So for acreages identified within state-owned lands, the default activity is not agriculture. If we get an indication from the state agency that there will be areas that are leased for agriculture or that there is enrollable activity, then we will pursue enrollment with the leasee. And we use the state-owned lands Solaris geodatabase to identify these acreages. Another category where we see high numbers is the aerial review or DOR parcel unlikely ag. So these are parcels that did not have an ag tax classification and were classified as non-agricultural land uses such as single-family homes, urban commercial uses, churches, utilities. And we also did aerial review to perform, to check these selections. And the pie chart just, again, gives a really good visual of what these numbers mean. Okay. And so here we have a slide that kind of breaks down what is likely agriculture. And so what is likely agriculture are features that in fact had ag tax classifications and the land use based on the property appraiser indicated this is likely agriculture. So grazing land or cropland or other sorts of those categories. But what you will notice is that in terms of the amount of ag acres within a parcel, which is how we evaluate the parcels that contain the ag, there's a lot of workload to be done in those parcels that contain 1 to less than 25 acres of ag. So that is our highest count of parcels that we would have to address. And the bar chart on the right, again, just gives a good overview of what this workload means in terms of enrolling the remaining acreage that we did identify as agriculture. So here we have a another look at the numbers you first saw for the Upper Ocklawaha. You know, we have the 100,000 acres of ag, we have the 22,000 acres that are enrolled, and that gives us 22% of the ag acres that are enrolled. However, if we take out those unlikely enrollable areas, and does not mean that we don't look at them, this just means that in terms of enrollment priority, because of what the land use is telling us, what the data is telling us, we're not going to go there right away, and they need to be discussed with DEP and the other entities who may own these properties and see what's going to happen. So if we take out those 36,000 acres from the total 100,000 total acres, our adjusted starting acres is closer to 64,000 acres of ag. So then if we consider that 22,000 enrolled acres of ag against the 64,000, that it shows, or our metric is actually closer to 34% of the enrolled ag lands. And this analysis is done for all BMAPs in our legislative report, which I'm going to talk about next. So here is a lovely screenshot of our legislative report. It's available in summer, and then, like I said, we provide metrics not just on enrollment, but the characterization and other metrics that people are interested, like irrigation. And we provide summaries by commodity, and there's a lot of good narrative on the updates that are happening within our program. And that is all I have. So thanks, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Yesenia. Any question in the chat, please ask your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand. All right, we have 1 minute to go through the survey that we have developed for the Summit for this session. Could you please fill that survey and let us know your thoughts? Emily, can you put that link in the chat box? This is a less than 1 minute survey, so please fill that and let us know your thoughts. Just to confirm, the link is in the chat box for the survey. All right, so the 1 minute is over, and I believe most of you have already submitted your survey. Please feel free to ask any questions if you may have. You can reach out to me through my email. The recording for this session would be on the website, IFS BMP website, so you can go there and watch it, and you can encourage other people to go and watch these recordings. The survey link will be also provided there. I do not see any question in the chat, so I think Yesenia, you are good to go. Thank you, Dr. Dukes and other people for your support in doing this BMP Summit possible.
There's a question in the chat about the CCA barcode.
Barcode.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think that is, Emily, is it the barcode is in the link that someone when register, the person
No, I don't have any information about the CCA CEUs because you registered all of those. So
Okay.
they would
I
just
will,
email you for that information.
okay, I will share that on the BMP website anyways for the audience to look at over. Michael, that's how we can do that now? Okay. Thank you. All right. With that, I would say thank you everybody for your presence for today's session, the first session of BMP Summit. Thank you, Chris and Yesenia, for your presentations. Definitely, I learned a lot today. And thank you, Michael, for your leadership and making this BMP Summit possible. Thank you, Emily, for all your arrangements and keeping the presenters on the top of it. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week, Tuesday, for our next session. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Alka.
you.